Okay, so I'm going to try to go through greetings and the first set of words. Now, I'm going to cover relevant rules and tendencies of Japanese as they come up, so don't get a little intimidated if it seems complicated at first. And here we go right from the start. What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to point to the word so you can try to remember how to pronounce it or hear it in your head. Then I'll pronounce it, and you can see whether you can hear what the tone that I'm using, and then I'll explain it. Try to get the best bang for your buck, I suppose. So here we have Ohayo, pretty normal greeting. Now, technically, this word is flat. It's Ohayo. However, I have mentioned in chat that the final high, or having an accent on the final syllable, and being flat are a little messy. In a similar language, Turkish, there's actually no difference, so maybe that'll help you think of why it's a bit so complicated. But generally, in a word that doesn't have an accent, it's not uncommon, in specific cases, for energy to be put on the last syllable, which ends up making it sort of have an accent. So you will very likely hear some people say Ohayo, but really you can say it either way. Of course, there's more energy in saying Ohayo, because that's why it's being said that way. Just be on the lookout for that. I'm going to say that phrase a lot, because that's really the mindset I want everybody to take from this. Then you have the whole phrase. Now, of course, you have Ohayo, but then you have gozaimasu. And I'm not super great with this, but I believe this comes from the accented word gozaru, with an older conjugation style. But verb rule you're going to run into a lot is that the mas ending erases the accent of the verb and puts the accent right here. But what you also are going to need to know is that the su at the end of this typically does not have the vowel pronounced. It's normally not gozaimasu, it's normally gozaimasu. In this case, there's no u for this to drop to, so we can't make an accent. So it's flat. So those are the two patterns you're going to hear with this. Ohayo gozaimasu and ohayo gozaimasu. Next we have konnichiwa, konbanwa, and sayonara. Didn't mean to rush through those. I forgot my own rules, but each of these is flat. You can really just remember that. And I'm also going to cover real quick one of the big mistakes English speakers make, which is when we're trying to shorten this, because it's very rare actually to hear somebody say konnichiwa. What we do is we drop the so we say konnichiwa, and if we don't know the accent, we'll say konnichiwa, and this is sort of like the traditional American sound. But natives, of course, aren't going to put an accent in here, and they're actually going to drop the ni. So if you want to talk, if you want to say hi to somebody casually, probably your best bet is to say konnichiwa. It's very common, so just bear that in mind. Konbanwa is normally just like that. Sayonara. I know you guys are all probably struggling a bit with all the long vowels, and it probably will not make you feel any better to know that natives tend to play sort of fast and loose with this, or maybe that will make you feel better. So I believe I've heard sayonara quite a few times, so, and you're going to hear some other words like honto becoming honto, so don't be panicked, you're not hallucinating. These actually are dropped a lot, and if you want to go further with sayonara, you have some sort of, I suppose you'd say girly girls that might say sayonara. I think that's the people that would say it, but I don't recommend any of us say that. But again, be on the lookout. Then, oyasumi nasai. This is, again, flat. This is going to be sort of a trend with a lot of these, is flat. Oyasumi nasai. This is, I'm not as familiar with the roots of this, but of course it's the nasai conjugation, which traditionally removes the accent and makes the word flat. So even taberu, which has a clear accent, becomes tabenasai. Now, I believe recently it might go back further, but I believe it's relatively recent that we started putting accents on the sai. So you might say tabenasai. Again, like I was talking about, putting the energy in the last syllable, especially if it's a long syllable, like I or o. All that said, though, I have not ever heard that happen here. I don't think I've ever heard somebody say oyasumi nasai. Maybe they do, but it's probably safest to just say oyasumi nasai. Luckily, we have quite a few natives here that might be able to clear up anything if they watch through. And here we have the famous thank you, arigato. I wanted to put the accent marks in here. So the accent on arigato is actually a bit tricky because it sounds like it's on the ga to most English speakers. It's actually right here. Arigato, arigato. Now, as for why it sounds like it's on the ga, there are a few reasons. It's possible that there are some regions where it is actually arigato, but I'm not aware of them. The big reason is something that's going to be sort of a bane for us English speakers, which is called ososagari, or delayed drop. So if you've ever tried to sing, you can't just, well, unless you're very good, you can't just jump right to a note. You have to go up to it. So even in this ma, where it's supposed to be high, it's not so much jumping up to it as sort of going up to it, then coming down. So really the accent is happening sort of within, you're only getting to the height within the character. And this natural little lag, which, you can get used to, it's not actually that bad. But with increased emotion, and I think I've read in a study that it's more common among young females, this can be delayed to the point where it's actually happening near the second, during the next character. So, and the reason why this might be confusing is where the accent is going to stick out the most is when there's all this emotion in it, which is going to make it much more likely that it's going to be delayed a little bit. Arigato, right? So, and I know some people are probably thinking, well, if there's all of this complicated stuff, why not just say arigato? Because that's, if natives say that, then just go with that. But the thing is, they're not really saying that. It's turning into that because of a specific phenomenon. And if you just try to copy the phenomenon without having the underlying structure, it's not going to sound right. And same thing with the gozaimasu, copy it over here. It's normally gozaimasu. And if the u is pronounced, it's gozaimasu. And same thing here, nothing too complicated. Well, a bit complicated, but nothing new. Arigatou gozaimasu. And here we get to our favorite sorry, sumimasen. Now, this comes from the verb sumu, or like be ended, be finished, with you saying your, let's say emotions, or maybe kolka, like regret is, like you don't have peace of mind. I believe that's where it comes from. And so you're saying, and that's why you can hear people say sumanai or suman, like those sorts of very casual ways. And so, sumimasen. And this has an accent right here. The accent from sumu, which is accented, by the way, sumu, gets deleted because we're putting it in the mas form. And the mas form in the negative develops an accent right there. And unlike here, where the u gets deleted, in order to pronounce this, you have to be using your vocal cords. So there is something to drop to. So it is always said sumimasen. Well, I say always. It is possible you might hear sumimasen, but I rather doubt it. If all this seems difficult, don't worry. In any language, the most complicated stuff is kind of front-loaded because these words people are using all the time. That's a lot of chances for individuals to kind of make things up as they go. So here we have our favorite robotic no. So the way it's going to be taught is probably flat, ie, but this is only half true. So this can be said that way, ie, to mean quite a, actually this works perfectly as translation. It's just no, but it's very robotic. It's very much in the negative, sir, But this not at all, that's something you'd say a lot more in conversation. Oh, not at all. And in that case, it's actually accented. So, two patterns, flat and accented. So when you're saying, oh, not at all, you say, yeah, often very shortened, yeah. So, two patterns here that are used in different contexts. I wouldn't worry about the difficulty of memorizing this too much because you're going to hear it. I say it's not very common just because, yeah and other words are more common, but you're going to hear it quite a bit, and English does have its own ups and pitch ups and downs. So that kind of emotional connotation, I think you won't have a terribly hard time with. And here we have this. Ittakimasu. Nothing too revolutionary here. It's iku. Well, it's a what's it called? Irregular verb, but the pitch is standard. So iku is flat. Iku. So it doesn't become ite, it becomes ite, at least in standard or Tokyo Japanese. And same deal from up here. Every time you hear mas, it's the same deal, the same conditions. So not too much to talk about. Now, what I was talking about with the sort of power on the last syllable, that applies here because on paper it's itterashai, but you're going to hear a lot of people saying itterashai. So optional accent. How should I write that? Maybe let's get a little fancy and do some little dashes. Optional accent. And now, tadaima, this is also flat. Nothing really to see here. And okaeri nasai. Okaeri nasai. It's probably said either way. This is not one I've got much confidence on because this nasai is not said much at all. Okaeri is a lot more common, and that is flat. And relatively sure this is going to be flat as well, but again, same deal with all of these long syllables. There's a bit more freedom here that natives are going to be playing with. Itadakimasu, from the polite itadaku, which is flat, but that doesn't really matter here because, again, mas is getting rid of that accent and turning to the same deal we've been seeing this whole time. Now, this word here, gochisou-sama deshita. This part is flat, and the des, high-low, desu, becomes deshita in the past tense. Now, I've talked about where when the vowel is gone, it loses the accent, it loses that power. But in this case, while there's no accent here, well, there's no vowel here, there is one here, so there is some place for it to go. So we keep the accent here. Gochisou-sama deshita. There's still a drop. And now, moving on to hajimemashite. I keep forgetting to let you all try to remember. I'll try to be better as we go on. Same deal. Generally, just as a rule you can remember, the accents for the past form are going to be the same for the te form. So, hajimemashite. Desu. Same deal with all these. It's accented. Desu. But because this vowel is often not pronounced, it's often just a des. And again, this word is all flat until the end. I've talked about how that's optional depending on whether it has a vowel or not. So pretty much same deal here. And I believe that des actually comes from the more formal phrase dearimasu. In the same way da came from dearu. So this is actually the same su that's here, if that's the case. I might be wrong, but relatively sure. Now, let's move on to the rest of the words. I think I missed one. Here we go. And I've got my phone here if there's something I'm not really sure of. It's a good review for me too. So, right off the bat, we've got a bit of a doozy. So, on its own, daigaku, not too bad. It's flat, no accent. What's going to make it tricky, and what might make it tricky, depending on how natives play with it, is in compound nouns. For instance, Tokyo Daigaku, or our sister school, Kokusai Kyoyo Daigaku. these are all long compound nouns, and the rule for those in general is that the accent goes 3 from the end. 3 from the end. Now, I've mentioned this already, but this is a syllable here. Daigaku. The reason this is important is because while you've probably heard that Japanese is a Mora-based system, so 1, 2, 3, 4, this is only half true. In the Kansai region, it is. It's all the way a Mora system, but in Tokyo, it's a bit of a mix. It's got some features of syllable and some features of Mora. So one of the features here is this, this might be hard to understand if you've internalized enough Japanese theory, but with all the Mora rules. But if you're just thinking in English, it's actually pretty intuitive. I is a single syllable. It becomes a single, the word is diphthong, which then can have its own can play by its own rules. And one of the rules of this diphthong is you can't have an accent here. You can't say daigaku. That's not possible in Tokyo or standard Japanese. So what do we do here? And this is in compound words. Don't take this as being this word. Well, we either move that, we move that down step either earlier or later. You're going to see some common words have it move later, but overall, it's more common to move it earlier. So that's why Tokyo Daigaku moves 4 from the end, because of that rule with the E. Now, you don't have to memorize that right now, but it's going to come up a lot, and once you've internalized that, it actually makes things a lot easier. It simplifies a lot of things. So the reason I say this is such a doozy is that feature, in addition to, I talked about this the other day as well, we're seeing a trend of words that are two kanji with Chinese pronunciations developing an atamadaka or head-high accent. So I wouldn't be surprised if natives are increasingly saying this as daigaku. For safety reasons, not life safety, but just for accuracy reasons, you probably stick to saying daigaku. But if you hear it said daigaku on its own, of course you're going to hear that as part of longer words, but if you hear it said on its own as daigaku, it's part of this new phenomenon. Cool. I believe this is flat. Actually, I haven't said this word enough, not being a high schooler myself, so I'll check real quick as I talk. But I'm quite sure, relatively sure I should say, that this is flat. And yep, it is flat. But all the things I talked about here, because this is also two Chinese characters and two Chinese pronunciations. So all the stuff I was talking about compound nouns and increasingly saying it head high, applies the same here. Say kooko yourself, but don't be surprised if you hear kooko. And here we get to gakusei. So, here's a plane going. I'm going to pause it real quick. So, gakusei is flat. And this is, I've talked about the increasing head-high accent, but traditionally the rule has been words that are 4 mora and 2 kanji are overwhelmingly flat. So it's true if you just put that as your default, that is your standard for words like that, your batting average is going to go up dramatically. So gakusei, also no accent. I haven't written any permanent accents yet. And here we get to daigakusei. And here's where the fun begins. So here's another rule you can remember. I've talked about the 3 more from the end. That's actually a general trend for all nouns throughout Japanese. Well, it's more specific than that, but it's not limited to just compound nouns. It's also the case in other situations too. And the one right here is words that are 5 mora or more are overwhelmingly nakadaka with the accent 3 from the end. Now, what's also going on here is because this ku is right before another devoiced, S, you're not using your voice there. This is not pronounced as daigakusei, but daigakusei. So if you want to, you can keep going up for the accent just with your breath, daigakusei. But whether you mean to or not, same thing for, and applies for natives too, it becomes daigakse. So you can really do it either way. And I believe this is officially recognized as well. And I can check my dictionary for this also quite quickly, because, of course, they're not trying to force everybody to speak a certain way. They're trying to represent, I'm talking about the people that write these dictionaries, are trying to represent the way people speak. And yep, here we have it. Both are included. So whichever way you want, daigakse or daigakse. Of course, there's, in practice, not much difference. But there we go. And everything I've just talked about applies for this as well. Ryugakse. Ryugakse. Basically the same, and you can think about it either way you want. And then we get to some of one of our exceptions. I talked about how 2-character words with 4 or more are overwhelmingly flat. Here's one of those exceptions. And I'd actually missed this. I've been collecting words like this recently. This is accented. It's sensei. Now, it's not sensei. That's not right, but it is sensei. And now I'm going to show you what I do. I've made some different lists, and you can actually see here I have a list for Heiban words, sometimes pronounced by Tokyo speakers as atamadaka. So I'd actually been looking into that phenomenon for quite a bit. But I'm going to put this in my nakanaka nouns. Nakanaka nouns. Nakanaka nouns has got a certain flow to it. So these are quite rare. I talked about the tendency for words like this, for this kind of accent 3 from the end in long nouns and in compound nouns. It's also the case in English words, at least traditionally, words from English. But in native Japanese words, not Japanese or Chinese origin words that are 4 mora or less, it's very rare. I've been making a list now of every one that I hear or remember, and I'm just now at 25 words. So this is very much the exception. So pay attention when you hear this, because it's going to sort of violate the patterns you're hearing in other words. And here we see nensei, which is not a word on its own, but what's the word? Suffix. And now, any kind of thing like this that has to do with, what's the word? That has to do with quantity is going to have quite a lot of speaker variation, another plane. So as I was saying, any word that has any compound, this is a single word that has to do with quantity. The numbers themselves are relatively consistent, but these compounds have a lot of speaker variability. So what I was talking about with this 3 from the end, daigakse, that can apply here too. And again, because also makes a syllable, nim is a single syllable, even though it's 2 mora, it also will bump that accent back here. Or you can say it just no accent at all. You can say ichinensei. Well, I don't think I've checked with ichinensei, but I have checked with sannensei. And at least with sannensei, you can pronounce it flat or accented. And in fact, let me turn off my Bluetooth here and show you exactly how I'm going to study this. So I've put this into Youglish, and now I'm going to, terrible internet out here, but I'll wait to hear you. So you can hear he said there, ichinensei. And I'll keep going and see if you can say it. Oh, this is part of a compound. So it's not going to be terribly useful. Here we go. I haven't heard it pronounced flat, so I might actually be wrong there. I have noticed in other compounds that sound tends to make things flat sometimes, so I might be wrong there. But I'd advise you not to worry too much about the numbers, because generally, if in these combinations, if you put it 3 from the end and bump it back if there's a not allowed character, then you'll be all right, because there's probably a lot of natives saying it that way too. There's a lot of speaker variation here, and if we want to get it exactly right, it's going to take quite a bit of effort, and that's not something I've super studied, so just, again, bear all this stuff in mind. Moving on, this first little spot is taking a lot of my, it's really taking its fair share, let's say. So senko is also flat, and just as I was saying that, I thought, am I sure? Did I actually read that in my dictionary? So let's do that. Let's go to my dictionary and check. And I use that English app if there's not accent notation in my dictionary. So let's put that in. Yep, it's flat. So senko. So I believe every single morpheme here is from China, is from Chinese. So maybe not you, but I'm not sure. At least most of them. And so what you're going to find with these Chinese origin morphemes, and morphemes is just referring to the smallest unit of language that has meaning. It's not like, for instance, well, the D in Japanese doesn't have its own meaning, but dai can have quite a few meanings. And so these Chinese ones, they tend to be very samey. There's actually an example, I'm not sure if it's worth pulling up in my dictionary, but the same characters of the kanji from takai and koe come together to be read as, and it can be read two different ways. The native Japanese reading is takagoe or takagoe. Either is acceptable. And if you look up those same sounds, there's no other words pronounced that way, at least not in my dictionary. So it's essentially a completely unique word. Or you can read those characters, those same characters, takai and koe, and you can read that the Chinese way as kouse, in which case there's 21 other words read exactly like that, as well as 3 other words that are kouse. So, and as I was talking about with the line between the atamadaka and heiban getting blurred in some cases, just in general, I don't want to be rude, but these Chinese readings are going to be a bit of a struggle for us. So if you hear them, if you're hearing words and you're going, this sounds like 100, 200 words I already know, you're probably not making it up. That's probably the case. So just know what you're dealing with and sort of try to go through the 5 stages of depression and get to acceptance if you can. So moving on finally to some native Japanese words, which are quite much less of a pain to discuss. We have watashi. This is flat. It's not watashi. It's not watashi. It's watashi. Not much to talk about there. And tomodachi, same thing, flat. You're going to notice, I believe the stat was about 70% of Japanese nouns are flat. So your job isn't to remember which ones are flat. That's, for nouns at least, that shouldn't be the default. That should be, the default. Your job is to remember which ones do have an accent and listen for that. So both of these, nothing to look at, nothing to see here, both flat. Then we have san, which adds on to names. And if let me see. This is flat. It does not have its own accent, of course, as it's a suffix. But if it attaches on to a name that's accented or a name that's unaccented, either way, it stays flat. The exception here is you're probably used to the word tachi, suffix tachi, which adds on to things. And when that happens, it makes a new word with its own accent. So that's why, for instance, this here, I wish I could write Japanese, but as anybody that's talked to me at the club knows, I cannot. So let's just use romaji. So if we make otashitachi, then technically, with the 3 accent rule, you would expect it to be here. And I think that is technically where it originally was. But of course, we've lost the vowel here, so it becomes watashitachi. So, tachi, don't ignore it. It's making new words with their own accent. Generally, in fact, I think all the time, accented. So if you put this after san, so you're saying san tachi, then it does get an accent. But don't get that mixed up with san on its own. That's because of tachi. And here we move on to one that's actually pretty easy to talk about, jin. And of course, this is I believe the Chinese reading, the general rule I know is Japanese readings on their own and Chinese readings in words, just most of the time. So I've never heard this. I don't think you can say this as its own word. It's going to be hito. But you're using it in compounds. And the rule here is actually pretty simple. The accent goes one before it. A big mistake we make, if we can jump on down here, is saying Amerikajin, because one issue I've talked about, the short syllables and long syllables. And one of the reasons that's so tricky for English speakers is we hear those long syllables like they have an accent. So we want to match up the pitch with the length, because in English, they're part of the same axis, you could say. But it's not Amerikajin, it's Amerikajin. And if you just remember that rule, that the one before it gets accented, that's going to improve your batting accuracy for a lot of words. Chugokujin, Kankokujin, Igirisjin. I think that's the case. I haven't actually heard that, I don't think. But I was talking about how it normally moves back, but there are some common examples where it moves later, and this is one of them, though. It's Nihonjin. At least in Tokyo / standard Japanese, it's Nihonjin. Now, in Kansai, it is Nihonjin. It is Nihonjin, but I don't recommend we speak this way because at least the Japanese people I've talked to are rather touchy about imitating the Kansai dialect if you are not actually from there. So I recommend going with Nihonjin. And now we're getting on to some more words. So ima is supposed to be accented, high-low, ima. But as I've talked about, these really common words tend to have a lot of the speaker variation. And I have heard this pronounced ima from some speakers. Some of them from regions, and I think I've also, different regional accents, and I think I've heard it from Tokyo speakers as well. So just be on the lookout for this word. It's probably also pronounceable as ima. It is not pronounced as imawa. It's either imawa or imawa. So don't go putting an accent here. But while I recommend you pronounce it yourself as ima, don't freak out if you hear it as ima. You're not losing your mind. Gozen. Again, accented. Same thing with gogo. And as I'm talking, of course, I haven't really checked these words very much because they don't stick out. So I can just make sure that my instincts are... What's the word for that? I'm not actually being pretentious here. I've actually forgotten. Making sure my instincts are not messing me up. So, yep. Gozen. Same thing with gogo. Should be. And then with G for o'clock. Let me actually think. I believe this puts the accent before it because you have Dokuji and Ichiji and the other one's like Sanji. Is that right? Is it Sanji? Let me make sure. Yeah, Sanji. Of course, have the, what would you call it? Out of bounds characters because they're part of a syllable. But again, as I've said, all these combinations are a bit tricky and there's a lot of speaker variations, so I wouldn't stress too much about it. Yeah, it seems like the accent is, before G, just the one right before, not two before, but one before, which means this is Ichiji. And then we get to ha, which does have an accent. Of course, it's a suffix, but I believe this takes the accent off the previous word and puts it on ha. So I can check that here. I'm going to be real open if there's something I'm not sure about. It looks like I'm not going to find that in my... And so, since I can't find it in my dictionary, I'm going to go on to Youglish and see what I can find. No, that's got gurai or gurai. And so, this is jumping ahead a little, but the reason why I don't use or don't take into account certain clips is because there are quite a few phrases in Japanese, such as gurai, which delete the accent that comes before them in the phrase before them and put it on the gu. So, of course, it's going to be nijihan gurai because it can't be anything else. So, if I ignore some, it's because I've seen something like that.
9時半でしょ許して
Yep, it seems to be on the ha. Let's check another one or two to make sure.
保育園は遅刻するときは9時半までには必ず電話してくださいね
Yep. Seems to be on the ha. And it's most likely that way for other numbers as well. But I wouldn't worry, again, as I've said before, don't worry too much about numbers, just play it by ear. Now we're on to our favorite words, the others. So the word for Japan is Nihon. Nihon. The reason why this can be a little confusing is the word for two long cylindrical sort of things is Nihon. Nihon. And if I remember correctly, in the Kansai region, these two are actually reversed. So they'll say Nihon for Japan, and I think Nihon for two cylinders. But again, I don't know much about Kansai, only things I've heard here and there. As far as we're concerned, because we're not trying to sound like people with that accent, we're going to say Nihon for Japan and Nihon for two cylinders. And here we have home sweet home. America. Now this is not America. That's how we say it because it's America. But in Japanese, it's flat. America, America. And here we get to go. And this is going to be one of the trickier things. I talked about how long words that are 5 or more, or compound words almost always have an accent 3 from the end, or the equivalent if there's something stopping them. But there's a list that I'm currently finding and expanding of suffixes which ensure the word they're put into becomes flat. There's not many of them. Let me pull it up. Suffixes that guarantee lack of accent in compounds. Ben. Well, ironically, many of these are accented if you say them on their own. So ben. So I've talked about kansai ben. Now that's a long word. So you'd expect, as I did when I was first saying it to be kansai ben, because of all the rules I've talked about earlier. But ben is one of those ones that guarantees that guarantees it's flat. Kansai ben, Tokyo ben. And when people joke about American Japanese, they might jokingly say America ben. They're not going to say America ben, but America ben, because that's the rule here. And there's quite a few of these. Not too many. I'd say you can memorize them quite easily. But one of them is go. So it becomes Nihongo, Chugokugo, Kankokugo, Eigo. And this applies every single word that uses this. So anytime you're talking about a language, you can actually be sure that it's flat. Even if there's a language you've never heard of before. Let's say, that's probably rare, but if you were talking about Russian and you'd never heard that before, but you knew the word for Russia, you could just say Roshiago, and you've got it right. So, very useful. Sai. Now, this is not one of these that takes away the accent. You're going to have the accent again, 3 from the end. So, 19 sai, or 16 sai. Again, in both cases, you have indok. It's deleting the accent there because there's no vowel for it to be there. And in Q, it's because that's a long syllable, so it's 19 sai. But, just generally think of it as being accented, normally 3 from the end, and you should be fine. Denwa, this is flat, but I might have seen it in the list of words that are beginning to be pronounced tamataka. So I will recommend you say it denwa, but again, don't freak out if you hear it as denwa from a native. Just play by ear. Ban, same deal as sight. It goes before. The exception here, I'll say it real quick, is ichiban, which can be pronounced ichiban, but it's more common for it to be pronounced ichiban. So just, you're going to hear a lot of things like that where things sort of form their own little bubble in the language and play by their own rules. So just bear that in mind. But generally, you can put the accent right before. And now we have bango, which is accented. I mentioned that words that are not English, nouns that are non-English and are nakadaka are quite rare, but this is one of them. Bango. Then we have namae. This is flat. And now we get to some of the more interesting stuff. So, nani. In Tokyo or standard Japanese, it's supposed to be nani. But it's often pronounced nani. And there are different reasons for this. One is because you have general phrase level power sort of overtaking the accent, because there's sort of a competition there. I might post some studies about that, or at least one that I've read in chat later. So generally when Japanese people are very surprised, they might say nani, and I'm sure you've heard this, it's made its way into American meme culture. But in theory it's supposed to be nani and nanno, like nanda. But increasingly, I've talked about how the power can take it away. But there are some other reasons why this might happen, because it's not only when people are talking very powerfully, as I talked about back here. Increased power, as well as a correlation with being young and female, makes it more likely to delay the drop a little, for the pitch to sort of fall behind the letters. And that might be a reason why it's pronounced this way, because it's not just flat in this case. It's like naniga. The other possibility is in the Kansai region, it is pronounced nani with the accent on the ni. So instead of naniga becomes something like naniga. Although I'm sure I'm butchering that, as Kansai has certain rules I'm not familiar with for how things are pronounced. It's a very different system. So the three theories here are: the reason why it's pronounced as nani, naniga, is an import from Kansai, or it could be due to a general delay of the pitch falling, or it could be due to general power sort of hiding the accent. But for whatever reason, and this goes for all question words, generally all question words in Japanese are technically pronounced atamadaka, or head high, doko, dare, nande, naze. But you're going to increasingly hear them, especially I've heard it by young people, pronounced low to high. Nani, doko desu ka? So just bear that in mind. Again, you're probably going to want to pronounce them high-low, especially since that seems to be technically correct. But be on the lookout. Ano is flat. Nothing to really see here. And then hai is a bit interesting, because it's technically high-low. Hai. But if you are, for instance, it's almost a sarcastic way of responding. You can say like, hai. So like, excuse me, what the fuck? Like, I'm not sure if I should be cussing here, but hai, you might hear that. And all the complicated stuff about phrasal pitch hiding the accent is likely coming into play. Or you could just think of it as another pronunciation for another situation. But hai is if you're just being normal and polite. And you can say hai if you're actually just being like, what the hell are you talking about? And here we get on to, this first video is probably going to be the hardest, because I've got to break into all the tricky stuff. So the short answer for this is it's so desu ka. The long answer is so is an adverb. It's also an interjection, which means there's actually technically two patterns for so. If you're saying, yeah, like that, you could be saying so, in which case it is high, low. But when it's functioning as an adjective, like so, sorry, not adjective, I've been saying the wrong thing. When it's functioning as an adverb, it's so it's flat. So omoimasu. Something like that. A good example sentence doesn't really come up, but so yatte, it's flat. But one of the trickier rules, and I talked about this in my post the other day, is that adverbs, many adverbs which are flat, when a particle or helping verb, which de and des are, because remember, da and des are, because they both come from de and dearu and dearimasu. So it's really not a problem if you think about da and des as being particles, the same as ga or o or wa. So in those cases, it becomes odaka or final high. So I mentioned ichiban and how it can be pronounced ichiban or ichiban. But when it's pronounced ichiban as an adverb, he's like, I don't know, ichiban yatta koto or something. But if you put a particle in between, it develops an accent on the ba, because, you're putting the accent at the end, final high. But as I've been talking about with these long syllables, it moves back one. And hopefully you can now see why I said just being aware of that rule makes things a lot less complicated, because otherwise you'd be thinking, well, how did I get from there to there? So, so and ko and a are all parts of that category of adverbs. And I've made a list in my phone that I can probably post later of just ones that have stuck out to me. But that's why it becomes so desu. That's why it's so omoimasu, but so to wa omoimasen. That's why it changes. So be on the lookout for that. And then we get on to countries. There's not a whole bunch to talk about here. Generally, these are just memorize them as you hear them, because I don't know, for some reason names like this are easier to remember. But Igirisu is flat. It's not Igirisu or Igirisu, it's Igirisu. So this is flat. And then the rules I was talking about for long words or compound words, or remember English words, also apply here. So Australia goes there. Same thing with Canada. I don't think it's Canada. It should be Canada. And then if we look at the words for Korea and China, these are both atamadaka. And there's really nothing to do but memorize this. Kankoku, Chugoku. And because I don't talk about these countries much, I'm actually going to consult my phone as I discuss them. And I recommend you build this habit as well if you're trying to improve. And of course, Canada is not in my phone, but I'm going to make sure I'm giving everybody correct information by looking it up. And Indo should also be high-low. And I can just check as we go along. I'm really unsure about many of these, so there's a case to be made for cutting the lesson here, but as we wait for all of that to load, I'll cover the other ones that stick out to me. So, Rekishi is flat, and Bungaku should be accented. Generally, words that have gaku in them, for instance, like different fields of study, can be pronounced accented before the gaku. So remember, 3 from the end, but because it's the sound, 1 before. So let me just check to make sure. Yep, bungaku. And for instance, if you're talking about studying languages, you'll say gogaku. You can say gogaku, but you can also say gogaku, because this sort of gives you a helpful assurance that you can pronounce it accented. So remember that for gaku when you're talking about different areas of study. And most of these should follow the 3 from the end rule, but I see keizai here, which is atamadaka. Kogaku, I think, is flat. Not entirely sure. This word's long enough, you can basically be sure that it's accented. Kokusai kanke. And here we can start talking about English loanwords. Computer. Because I don't think it applies here, actually. I'm being very messy this lesson, as you can see, but generally for loanwords from English, it's probably not the case with names, but things such as traditionally pronounced storage for like computer storage, but my friends all pronounce it storage. So there's the old rule was 3 from the end. The new rule is flattening. Again, don't be worried about memorizing all this, just be getting a feel for it. But I think computer is long enough. I wouldn't trust that rule because all that time that you're talking, that you're pronouncing it flat, is sort of building pressure where you want to drop. So the longer the word is, the more likely it is to have that drop. So computer, I'd stick to that. Seiji is flat. Again, with the gaku, you can probably pronounce it seibutsugaku. And I'm willing to bet, because again, I've advised everybody to make little bets as they're studying this. I'm willing to bet that because of the tsu being rather hard to pronounce, it will also be allowed to move back 1. So let's check. I don't see it written in my dictionary, so it looks like I was wrong about that. So just stick to seibutsugaku. Anything else on this page? I want to say this is actually pronounced bijinesu, but I'm not confident in that. Yep, so this is another exception. Again, the rules about 3 from the end or flat for English words, 99% of the time it's true, but remember the exceptions. Another one that I'll sort of spoil for you here is teiburu. That's only flat. And then isha, I believe, is just flat, but I'll check to make sure. Isha, yep, no accent here. And then kaishain, nakadaka, which of course 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 has 5 mora, so it's most likely going to be nakadaka. Forgetting how to speak. So let me make sure. Oh, there's a few more. Okay. Kangoshi. I think this is accented on the go. Not super confident. Yep. Kangoshi. And while I'm here, I'll add it to my nakadaka nouns. It's some good study for me. And here we are onto koukosei. Now this is a long word. It's got 6 mora. Remember, 5's the border where we start putting accents on things. So go 3 from the end, and we have the u from ko. But remember, we can't put an accent here, and it's most likely we're going to move it to the left. So this becomes koukosei. Shifu, I believe, it's accented. But again, as with a lot of these words, I don't hear them very much. So let's make sure. And yep, shifu. All the things I was talking about here apply the same here. Daigaku insei. We want to move it 3 from the end, but we can't put it here, so move it 1 more. Daigaku insei. And then bengoshi, same as kangoshi, should be accented here. And yep, bengoshi. And we're finally getting to some of the really interesting stuff. So okasan and otosan aren't anything super surprising. You can probably already hear. These are very intuitive for English speakers because the accent, the pitch, is lining up with the long syllable. So it sounds very natural to us. Okasan, otosan. Same thing here. Oneesan, oniisan. Here's where things get tricky. These 2 words, if you just memorize these, are going to make, well, it's going to make a lot of things click because in order to understand these, you're going to be able to then hear them. So English speakers, remember I'm talking about these long vowels, we want to say imoto and we want to say ototo, but it's not. It is not pronounced that way. It is imotoga, ototoga. And I highly recommend with these Odaka words, you just commit them to memory. And I think the best way to do that, because it's also very difficult for us to pronounce these, it doesn't come naturally at all, just make them as English sounding as possible and put a very heavy accent on it. Like, imotoga. Like, it sounds silly, I know, but just ingrain in your mind that there's an accent here on this to. Imotoga, ototoga. And if you can get that sort of movement when speaking it like it's an English word, then you can gradually bring it back and begin to actually see how the contours are happening. Imotoga, ototoga. That should be all for the vocabulary for this lesson. So I will stop here and then go.